David Foster was an ordinary man living an ordinary life in a small town on the outskirts of the city. He wasn't a celebrity, nor did he ever dream of fame. Instead, he was the owner of a local construction company, a job that kept him busy and grounded. His days were filled with phone calls, meetings, and overseeing various projects across the region. He was the kind of man who would work late into the evening to ensure that things were done right, and the type of person who always stuck to his principles. Politics, while not his primary focus, was something he followed closely, especially in recent years. As a staunch Republican, David was passionate about his views, unafraid to speak his mind, though he preferred not to stir up conflict unnecessarily. His MAGA hat was a symbol of his pride in those beliefs, something he wore occasionally when he wasn't dealing with clients or business matters. One Tuesday morning, David found himself preparing for a business trip. It was a quick overnight stay in the nearby city to attend a real estate development seminar, followed by a meeting with a potential investor. His usual hotel was fully booked, so he decided to try a new one, a small but upscale hotel known for its modern amenities and central location. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but the reviews were excellent, and it was known to cater to business travelers like himself. After confirming his reservation over the phone, David felt a sense of relief. All he needed now was to get on the road and make it to the hotel in time to check in, get settled, and rest before the big day. As he drove to the hotel, the landscape outside his car window was a blur: rolling hills, occasional patches of dense forest, and small suburban homes that gave the area a calm, almost sleepy feel. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place, where the biggest event was a local football game or the occasional town hall meeting. David had always felt at home here, comfortable in the quiet pace of life. When he pulled up to the hotel, it looked just as he had imagined, modern but welcoming, with a sleek design and glass doors that led to a spacious lobby. David parked his car, grabbed his bag, and made his way into the hotel. The first thing he noticed as he stepped inside was how polished everything looked. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the front desk was manned by a young receptionist with a friendly smile. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. The receptionist greeted him warmly and asked for his name to look up his reservation. As he mentioned his name, the young woman's expression shifted slightly, becoming more neutral. David didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to the usual routine of checking in guests. But when she looked down at his head and saw his MAGA hat, her smile faded just a little more. "I'm sorry, sir," she said hesitantly, "but we have a policy here regarding attire, and that includes political symbols." David blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Political symbols," she repeated, now looking more uncomfortable. "I can't check you in if you're wearing that hat. It goes against our company policy. I'm afraid I can't make an exception." David was stunned. He had stayed in hotels all over the country and never encountered such a policy. He'd been to conferences, meetings, and events, often wearing the hat, and never once had anyone raised an issue. This was the first time anyone had ever made a stand against it. He glanced around the lobby to see if anyone else had noticed the situation. The few guests in the area seemed to be preoccupied with their own business, unaware of the brewing tension at the front desk. David's first instinct was to laugh it off, thinking this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. He had made reservations, after all. He had paid for the room, and this was simply a stop on his way to a business meeting. But something in the receptionist's eyes told him she wasn't joking. She wasn't going to let him in, and her decision felt absolute. "Is there a manager I can speak to?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. The receptionist nodded but didn't seem eager to comply. "Sure, but I'll need to let them know why you're asking. It's our policy. You won't be able to stay with that hat on." David's frustration grew as she disappeared to find the manager. It wasn't just about the hat anymore, it was the principle of the matter. Why was this such an issue? He had never felt like he was causing trouble by wearing his hat. It wasn't aggressive, and it certainly wasn't meant to incite anything. It was simply a symbol of his beliefs, something that, to him, represented a sense of pride. How could a hotel, a place that served everyone, take a stand like this over something so trivial? As the manager arrived, David's sense of unease began to deepen. The man, slightly older and dressed in a sharp suit, approached the counter with a polite but rehearsed smile. The situation was getting more uncomfortable by the second. "Good evening, sir. How can I help?" the manager asked, his tone smooth and neutral, as though he had dealt with this kind of thing many times before. David felt his jaw tighten. "I'd like to know why I'm being refused service because of a hat. A hat that has nothing to do with your hotel, nothing to do with my stay, and has certainly never caused a problem before." The manager hesitated before responding. "Sir, it's our policy to ensure that all guests feel welcome and that no political affiliations are highlighted during their stay. We are a neutral space for all guests, regardless of their political views." David raised an eyebrow. "A neutral space? So, if I wore a Democratic hat or anything with a political affiliation, you would do the same thing?" The manager nodded slowly. "Yes, it's about creating an inclusive atmosphere. It's not personal, sir, it's just policy." David could hardly believe what he was hearing. A hotel refusing service over a hat? What kind of message was this sending? How far was this policy really going? Before he could say anything else, the manager turned to the receptionist, exchanging a silent glance before offering to refund David's payment. David stood there, stunned, as his emotions churned. He had to make a decision: would he let this slide, or would he push for more answers? He knew that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just about a policy or a disagreement. It felt like a turning point. Little did he know that this seemingly small encounter was about to change the course of his life, and would soon uncover truths he never expected to find. David stood at the front desk, his mind racing as the manager finished offering the refund. It wasn't just the inconvenience of the situation that irritated him, it was the principle behind it. He had paid for a room, made a reservation, and was being treated like an outsider for something as small as a hat. His MAGA hat had never caused a problem before, and yet here he was, standing in a high-end hotel lobby, being told it was somehow an issue. His gut told him something was off. This wasn't about a policy, it was something deeper. A part of him wanted to walk away, to take the refund and forget about the whole incident. But another part, the part that always stood firm for his beliefs, wasn't about to let it go. David took a deep breath. "I'm not leaving," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "I need to speak with the owner of this hotel." The manager's face faltered for a moment. His eyes shifted nervously, as if unsure how to handle the growing tension. "Sir, I can assure you that this is nothing personal," he said quickly. "It's simply a company-wide decision. You're free to stay, but the hat." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation was heading. David shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "No, I don't think you understand. I'm not asking to speak to the owner because I want an apology or some sort of special treatment. I want to know why this is happening. Why are you refusing service because of something so trivial? And don't tell me it's about inclusivity, that's just a way to dodge the real issue." The manager's jaw tightened slightly. There was a flicker of something, annoyance? Guilt? But before the manager could respond, the receptionist spoke up, her voice softer than before. "I really think you should talk to the owner. I just work here, I don't make the rules," she said, her tone not apologetic but resigned, as if she, too, had seen enough of these kinds of incidents. David didn't know whether to feel sorry for her or angry at her complicity. She was just doing her job, but it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. "Fine," he said, "I'll talk to the owner. But mark my words, this isn't over." The manager nodded stiffly and disappeared into the back office to make the call. David waited, pacing the lobby as the minutes ticked by. He noticed a few other guests glancing over, but no one approached him. They were either too uncomfortable with the tension or simply didn't care enough to get involved. David couldn't decide if that made him feel better or worse. The hotel, which had seemed like a warm, welcoming space just moments ago, now felt cold and distant. When the manager returned, he looked more composed. "The owner's office is on the line," he said, motioning for David to follow him to a side room where he could speak privately. David followed him, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, a stern voice on the other end? A sympathetic ear? What was the owner going to say? The manager handed him the phone. "Mr. Foster, this is Jonathan Hale. I understand you've had an issue with our check-in policy." David gripped the phone tighter. "Yes, Mr. Hale. I've had an issue. Your staff is refusing to let me check in because of my hat. I understand that you might have a policy in place, but this doesn't feel right. This isn't about being neutral, it's about discrimination." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jonathan Hale's voice came through smooth and controlled, but David could hear the slight edge of annoyance beneath it. "Mr. Foster, I assure you that we have rules in place to ensure the comfort of all our guests. I'm sure you can appreciate the need for a neutral environment, especially in the current political climate." David's blood boiled. "Don't talk to me about neutrality when you're the one discriminating against someone for simply wearing a hat. You're essentially telling me that my political beliefs aren't welcome here. You're choosing sides, Mr. Hale. And I'm not going to stand for it." There was another long pause. Jonathan Hale sighed audibly, as if weighing his next words. "I'm sorry you feel that way. But our policy is clear. I'll tell you what, I'll make sure the team processes your refund. And perhaps you might consider choosing another hotel in the future." David's head spun. He was being dismissed. His belief in fairness, his right to express himself, none of it mattered to this man. He was being treated like a problem to be solved with a refund, an inconvenience to be swept under the rug. He felt a surge of anger flood through him. But as the words left Hale's mouth, something else clicked in David's mind. "Wait a minute," David said, the realization dawning on him. "How do you know who I am?" Jonathan Hale seemed taken aback. "Excuse me?" David's voice grew colder, more calculated. "How do you know who I am? You're so quick to offer a refund, to dismiss me. You've never even met me. Why are you so confident in this policy? What makes you so sure I'd be willing to walk away from this? What makes you so confident that I'm not a part of this business?" There was a brief silence on the line. Hale's tone shifted, just a little. "Mr. Foster, I'm not sure what you're insinuating." "I'm insinuating that you don't know who you're dealing with," David said slowly. He leaned in closer to the phone, speaking more clearly now, every word calculated. "I own a substantial share of your company, Mr. Hale. In fact, I'm one of the largest shareholders of this hotel's parent company. So before you offer me a refund, perhaps you should think about how this might look for your brand." The words hit the air like a bombshell. There was a long pause before Hale spoke again, his voice suddenly wary. "Mr. Foster. I wasn't aware of that." David could hear the tension in the room on the other end of the line, and he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. For the first time, he had the upper hand. "I suggest you rethink this policy," David said firmly, his voice now calm but brimming with authority. "Because I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not going to let this go." The conversation ended abruptly, with Hale promising to address the issue and look into it further. David hung up the phone, his head still spinning. He had never imagined in a million years that something as small as a MAGA hat would lead him down this path. But now, everything had changed. He had power. He had leverage. And he wasn't about to let this injustice slide. What started as an ordinary business trip had just become something far bigger, and he had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go. The next few hours in the hotel felt like a blur for David. After hanging up the phone with Jonathan Hale, he sat quietly in the back room, trying to gather his thoughts. His anger was still simmering, but it had transformed into something more strategic. He now understood the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just about him being rejected at a hotel. It was about the implications of that rejection, about a larger, systemic issue of discrimination disguised as neutrality. He had seen firsthand how something as simple as a political symbol could become a divisive issue, how something as mundane as a hat could trigger an entire series of actions designed to push someone out of a space they had every right to occupy. David knew that he couldn't let this go, but the question was, what was he going to do about it? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He wasn't just dealing with a rogue hotel or an isolated incident. He was looking at a larger pattern, one that was happening in other places too, where people were being forced to hide their beliefs or face exclusion. The more he analyzed the situation, the more he realized that his experience wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a broader cultural shift happening across the country. People were either being silenced or pushed out of public spaces because of their political affiliations. What had happened to him could happen to anyone. And that, more than anything, was what motivated him to take action. When the manager returned to the room later that evening, he had a visibly uncomfortable look on his face. His posture was stiff, and his eyes seemed to avoid direct contact. "Mr. Foster, I'm afraid we have a situation," he began, sounding as though he had rehearsed the words in his mind. "I spoke with Mr. Hale, and he instructed me to let you know that there has been some misunderstanding. We've reviewed your situation and would like to offer you a free stay for the night." David felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. This wasn't what he wanted. He didn't need their pity or a free night's stay. He wasn't here to collect handouts or pretend like the issue would just go away. What he wanted was accountability. He wanted change. "No, I don't want a free stay," David said flatly. "I don't want to be placated with cheap offers. I want to know why your hotel, and by extension your company, thinks it's okay to deny someone access to a service they've already paid for simply because of a political symbol. That's not an offer I'm interested in. I want you to take action and fix this policy." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Mr. Hale has made it clear that the policy is unlikely to change. I'm afraid there's not much more we can do right now." David leaned forward, his eyes cold. "I don't believe you. I think you can do a lot more. I think you've been hiding behind that policy and making excuses for far too long." The manager opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. He clearly wasn't prepared for this level of confrontation. The exchange felt futile, like speaking to a brick wall, and David knew that he wasn't going to get anything meaningful from the manager. But that didn't matter. What mattered now was the bigger picture, and how he could take the next step in holding these people accountable. As he stood up to leave, he glanced around the sterile, clinical hotel lobby. It looked like any other upscale hotel, with its clean lines and muted decor. But now, it felt like a cage, a symbol of everything wrong with the society David had come to see. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a cultural divide that had been growing for years, and now it was at the forefront of his mind. David realized that his small, personal frustration had opened up a much larger question: how many other people had been subjected to the same kind of treatment, but never had the chance to speak up? How many people had been silenced by hotel policies, corporate guidelines, and societal expectations, all of which were designed to erase individual thought in favor of conformity? The thought weighed heavily on him as he packed his bag and left the hotel that night. His head was filled with ideas, and his resolve was stronger than ever. He wasn't going to let this stand, not for himself, and not for anyone else who had been made to feel like their beliefs were unwelcome. David didn't know exactly what his next steps would be, but he knew one thing: he would take this public. He would find a way to make sure that others who felt excluded for their beliefs had a voice, too. He'd write to the media, share his story, and make sure that the hotel's refusal to check him in wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a wake-up call to the larger problem that had to be addressed. Back at home, David started drafting emails and making calls, trying to get his story heard. They claimed that his actions were divisive, that he was more interested in amplifying his political views than in addressing the true issue of inclusivity. The backlash was swift, with dozens of think pieces, podcasts, and viral videos attacking David's stance. His every move was scrutinized, and with every news segment, the tension around his story continued to escalate. For a while, David found himself at the center of this storm. His phone never stopped buzzing: calls from reporters, interviews with news outlets, messages from strangers offering support or condemning his actions. At first, it was overwhelming. The comments, both positive and negative, piled up faster than he could process them. There were moments when he wondered if he'd made the right choice, if this was the kind of attention he truly wanted. The backlash felt personal at times. Some of the criticism wasn't just about his actions, but about his character, his beliefs, and even his past. But with each passing day, he steeled himself. He couldn't back down now. David began to focus on the bigger picture. He wasn't just advocating for his right to wear a hat, he was advocating for a principle that extended far beyond this one issue. His battle had become a symbol for the rights of all individuals to express themselves without fear of being ostracized. In his mind, the question wasn't just about a hotel policy, it was about the future of free speech in America, and whether or not there was space in society for differing opinions. Could someone with opposing views ever feel truly accepted again, or had we become a society that demanded conformity in every aspect of life? To drive his point home, David decided to take a more proactive approach. Instead of just responding to media requests, he would initiate his own campaign, one that highlighted the voices of others who had experienced the same kind of exclusion, but had never spoken out. He created a platform where people could share their stories anonymously, allowing them to open up about their experiences without fear of retribution. Within days, his website was flooded with submissions. Stories poured in from all over the country, stories of people being turned away from restaurants, told they couldn't fly because of their political views, or even being asked to leave public events simply because of the t-shirts they wore or the bumper stickers on their cars. The sheer volume of these stories surprised David, confirming what he had suspected all along: there were far more people who had felt marginalized by society than he could have ever imagined. David used these stories to fuel his campaign, posting some of the most impactful ones on his social media accounts. He worked with a few lawyers to draft petitions and letters, urging politicians to consider laws that would protect individuals from discrimination based on political expression. The fight had grown bigger than he ever anticipated, and it was clear that it wasn't just one hotel chain he was up against. This was a movement, and if he wanted to make a difference, he had to keep pushing. But with this new momentum came new challenges. As the movement gained visibility, so did the pressure. Corporate sponsors, who had once been eager to partner with David on his campaign, started pulling back, afraid of the political fallout. He received messages from companies distancing themselves from him, unsure of the potential damage to their reputations. Even some of his friends, who had initially supported his stance, began to question his tactics, worried about the long-term consequences of challenging the cultural norms that had taken root in the country. David could feel the weight of these doubts creeping into his thoughts, but he refused to let them sway him. He knew this was bigger than personal comfort, bigger than fear of backlash. If he didn't continue, then he was part of the problem. Meanwhile, the hotel chain itself had made attempts to address the controversy. They released a public statement apologizing for the misunderstanding, but their words felt hollow to David. The apology was vague, with no mention of any real change to their policies. It was a typical corporate response: disengaged, impersonal, and dismissive. David wasn't interested in empty words. He needed action. One day, David received an unexpected call. It was from an attorney representing the hotel chain. The lawyer wanted to discuss a potential settlement. David's heart sank. He had no interest in money. He wasn't doing this for financial gain. His fight wasn't about a payout, it was about principle. Still, he agreed to meet with the lawyer. The conversation, he realized, could offer an opportunity to push for change at a larger scale. When the day of the meeting arrived, David walked into the hotel's corporate office with a sense of purpose. The lawyer was cordial, but David could tell that this was all about trying to smooth things over, offering him some sort of compensation to make the situation go away. But David wasn't interested in their offers. He had one goal: to make sure that no one else would face the same discrimination that he had experienced. He wasn't going to settle for anything less than a complete reversal of the hotel's policy. If the company was serious about inclusivity, they needed to show it with more than just words. The meeting was long and tense. At one point, the lawyer even tried to convince David to accept a non-disclosure agreement, which would prevent him from discussing the details of the settlement publicly. David refused outright. He had made it this far by speaking out, there was no way he was going to stop now. In the end, the lawyer left with no agreement. David walked out of the office, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't going to be a quick fight, but he was willing to see it through, no matter what it took. And if that meant challenging powerful corporations, media outlets, or even public opinion, so be it. He wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the future of free expression and the right of every individual to stand up for what they believe in, no matter how unpopular it may be. David knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he was ready. And now, the fight was personal, not just for his rights, but for the rights of everyone who had ever felt silenced by the forces of conformity. As weeks turned into months, David's battle against the hotel chain and the larger issue of political exclusion continued to intensify. The pressure from both supporters and detractors was unrelenting. Media outlets continued to cover the story, with some framing it as a heroic stand for freedom of expression, while others painted him as a divisive figure exacerbating the country's already deep political divides. His name became a symbol of the cultural clash tearing at the fabric of American society, a lightning rod for debates about free speech, political correctness, and the limits of tolerance. David was no stranger to the backlash. He had long since accepted that speaking out for what he believed in would attract criticism. But even he couldn't have predicted the sheer scale of the attacks that would come. His social media accounts became a battleground where trolls and political adversaries alike took aim at his every move. The once supportive comments now mingled with venomous messages accusing him of stoking division, with some going so far as to threaten his safety. There were moments when the vitriol felt overwhelming. But David had something many of his critics didn't: conviction. While the media storm raged around him, David began to see that his personal journey had morphed into something much larger than he had ever anticipated. The calls and emails from individuals sharing their own stories of exclusion continued to flood in. People who had been shamed, disrespected, or even kicked out of public spaces because of their political views saw David stand as a glimmer of hope. They wanted their voices to be heard, too. From small business owners who had been criticized for supporting conservative causes to young students who had been ostracized for their political beliefs on college campuses, the stories seemed endless. David became the unofficial spokesman for a movement he hadn't planned on starting. And while the pressure mounted, he knew that he could not turn his back on these people who had placed their trust in him. One day, as he sat in his small office at home sifting through more messages, he realized that it wasn't just about standing up against a hotel anymore. The conversation had shifted from one of individual grievances to a nationwide discussion on the freedom to be who you are, regardless of your political affiliations. It wasn't just a Republican issue, a conservative issue, or a right-wing cause. it was a human rights issue. David's initial frustration over being denied service because of a hat had evolved into a full-scale fight for the protection of personal beliefs, for the right to stand firm in one's identity without fear of retribution or marginalization. Determined to bring the issue to a broader audience, David organized a rally to coincide with the anniversary of the day the incident took place. The rally, held in a park just outside the city, was advertised as an event for all those who had been silenced because of their political views. The turnout exceeded expectations, with people from all walks of life arriving to show solidarity. There were older men and women who had fought in wars, young students who had been told to stay quiet in class, teachers and professors who had been penalized for their conservative views. There were families who had been ostracized by their communities simply for expressing their political opinions. The rally was diverse, filled with people who had been told to hide their beliefs for too long. For many, it was the first time they had been able to speak freely about their experiences without fear of judgment or reprisal. As David took the stage that day, he was overwhelmed with emotion. The crowd cheered as he stepped up to the microphone, but it wasn't the cheers that moved him, it was the stories of the people he had come to know. Their words, their courage, their refusal to stay silent any longer, resonated deeply within him. He had no idea that his own fight would spark this much change. David began speaking, sharing his own journey and what had led him to this moment. He spoke about the importance of freedom of expression and the dangers of a society where people were made to feel ashamed of their views. "It's not about politics," he said. "It's about our right as individuals to live our truth, to be unapologetically ourselves, without fear of judgment. We are not just standing here for a hat. We are standing for every person who has ever been made to feel like they are not enough, simply because they think differently." The crowd erupted in applause. It was a moment of unity, a collective realization that this wasn't just a fight for one person's rights, it was a fight for all people who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or overlooked. In that moment, David saw how deeply entrenched this issue was in the lives of so many Americans. The sense of community that emerged from the rally was profound. The unity of people from all backgrounds, all walks of life, was a testament to the fact that this was not about partisan politics. It was about human dignity. But the rally was only the beginning. David's campaign, now known as Stand Your Ground, began to grow in influence. He launched an online petition asking for legal protections for people who face discrimination based on their political beliefs. The petition gained thousands of signatures almost overnight. Major media outlets started picking up on the movement, interviewing David and those who had attended the rally. Even some well-known political figures, across the political spectrum, began to speak out in support of the movement, agreeing that political expression should not lead to ostracism in public spaces. As the movement grew, so did the opposition. David knew that he couldn't expect everyone to agree with him, but the vitriol coming from some quarters was alarming. There were calls for boycotts of businesses that supported his cause, threats of violence, and organized campaigns to discredit him. It became clear that this wasn't just a debate, it was a full-blown cultural war. Yet, for David, the threats only solidified his resolve. He wasn't going to let fear stop him from fighting for what he knew was right. Amidst all the challenges, David received an unexpected message. It was from the hotel chain, the very one that had sparked this entire movement. The message was brief, but its implications were clear. The company had decided to change its policy. No longer would political affiliations be a reason to deny service. The company would implement diversity and inclusion training to ensure that all customers were treated with respect, regardless of their beliefs. While David was glad to see the hotel change its stance, he knew that this was just a small victory in a much larger battle. David realized that what he had set in motion could not be contained to just one company, one rally, or one cause. His movement had sparked something much bigger, an awakening in a country that had been increasingly divided by politics. It wasn't just about fighting for the right to wear a hat in a hotel. It was about fighting for the soul of the nation, ensuring that everyone, no matter their background or beliefs, had the right to live freely, without fear of exclusion or persecution. As David looked back on everything that had transpired, he realized how far he had come. From a single moment of frustration in a hotel lobby to leading a nationwide movement, he had learned one vital truth: standing up for what you believe in is never easy, but it is always worth it. The journey wasn't over, there were still battles to be fought, more people to stand up for, and countless other voices to amplify. But for the first time in a long while, David felt confident that the change he had started would continue to ripple outward, transforming not only the policies of companies, but the mindset of a generation. And in that, he found a quiet sense of peace, a recognition that, in the end, it was the courage to speak out that would shape the future. Months passed since David's pivotal rally, and the winds of change began to blow in unexpected directions. The movement he had sparked, initially just a personal fight against one hotel chain, had transformed into a national conversation about freedom of expression, political identity, and the rising tide of cultural intolerance. The more David reflected on his journey, the more he realized that what had begun as a single act of defiance had become a critical moment in a larger, more urgent cultural reckoning. People were reaching out from every corner of the country, sharing how David's stand had reignited their own courage to speak out, to challenge the norms that were increasingly being imposed upon them. But for David, the pressure of leadership was not without its burdens. Every day, he woke up to messages of support and criticism in equal measure. His social media feeds, once filled with affirmations of his principles, now seemed like an ongoing battlefield. His inbox, flooded with new stories of discrimination, was both empowering and overwhelming. Stories poured in from people who had been shamed in classrooms, fired from jobs, or ostracized from social circles simply for expressing their political beliefs. It seemed the more David spoke up, the more he realized just how many people felt like their voices were being silenced in the public arena. The battle was no longer about him alone, it was a fight for the future of free expression. The Stand Your Ground campaign was growing, too. David, now the figurehead of the movement, found himself balancing his personal life with a newfound responsibility that stretched him thin. His work with the media intensified. He had been invited to speak at universities, town halls, and even political rallies. Interviews with major networks became a regular occurrence, and each time David spoke, his message resonated with more and more people. But while his influence was growing, he knew that his path was not without risks. There were still powerful forces that wanted to suppress the conversation, forces that sought to drown out the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. One evening, as David sat at his kitchen table after another long day of interviews, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from a prominent civil rights attorney who had been following his case. The lawyer had represented individuals in the past who had fought for free speech, and his firm had been closely watching the movement David had started. The attorney told David that they were interested in taking his case to the next level. He wanted to help David file a lawsuit against the hotel chain for discrimination, but he also wanted to take the fight to a broader scale, challenging the practices of other organizations that excluded individuals based on their political identity. The attorney argued that the case had the potential to set a legal precedent for political expression in public spaces. David felt a surge of excitement, but also a wave of doubt. A lawsuit meant something far bigger than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just about a single hotel, it was about rewriting the rules of public accommodation. It was about whether or not a person could be barred from a service or a business simply for wearing a hat or expressing an opinion that someone else found offensive. The lawyer made it clear that they were not only aiming to challenge the policies of one corporation but to create a movement that would have long-lasting, national implications for political expression. They would seek a ruling that would make it illegal for businesses to discriminate against individuals based solely on their political views. The thought of it was overwhelming. David didn't make a decision right away. He took some time to think about the legal ramifications, the potential for public backlash, and the ethical responsibility he would carry if he decided to move forward. But in the end, the answer seemed clear. This was the next logical step in the fight, a chance to push for the kind of change that would protect future generations from the same kind of marginalization he had faced. If he could win this case, it would send a message to the nation: political expression is as vital as any other form of identity, and it deserves to be protected. The lawsuit, once filed, became a landmark case in the eyes of many. David's legal team, along with a coalition of civil rights organizations, worked tirelessly to build their case. It wasn't just about the hotel anymore, it was about corporations, public spaces, and the rise of cancel culture that was increasingly leaving many people feeling like they were unwelcome in the very places they had once felt free. The campaign spread like wildfire, gaining attention from some unlikely quarters. Even individuals from opposite ends of the political spectrum began to realize that this fight was bigger than party lines. There was a shared, underlying truth: the freedom to express oneself, without fear of losing opportunities or being shunned, was fundamental to a thriving democracy. As the court date drew closer, the weight of the case became even more tangible. David's name was now a symbol of both resistance and resolve. He had become a figure that many admired, but also one that many resented. The media covered the case extensively, but not all of the coverage was fair. Some news outlets painted him as a hero, others, as a divisive figure. He was both vilified and celebrated, his every move tracked and scrutinized. Behind the public persona, David struggled with doubt and pressure. He questioned his motivations, wondered if he had become too entangled in the national conversation, and sometimes even questioned the movement he had helped create. But deep down, he knew he couldn't turn back now. The court case eventually reached its climax on a warm autumn day when David stood before a judge, surrounded by his legal team, the media, and representatives of the hotel chain. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and even curious onlookers. As the proceedings unfolded, David felt a strange calm. This was the moment that could change everything. The lawyers on both sides made their arguments, but the heart of the case remained clear: could a business, a public entity, discriminate against someone simply because of their political beliefs? In the days that followed, the case captured the nation's attention. The public debate raged on, but David and his legal team remained steadfast. They had created a platform for countless individuals to share their stories, and they were determined to see it through. But when the judge finally issued a ruling, it was more than anyone had expected. The court sided with David. It wasn't just about the hotel anymore, it was about the broader principle of free political expression in America. The victory was a monumental one, not just for David but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like their opinions didn't matter. The case set a legal precedent that businesses could no longer discriminate against individuals based on their political identity. It was a groundbreaking decision that reverberated across the country, inspiring movements in other parts of the world. As the news spread, David received an outpouring of support from across the political spectrum. People from all walks of life reached out to thank him for standing up for the rights of every American to speak their truth. The victory was bittersweet, though. While the legal decision was a triumph, David knew that the fight for free expression was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more cultural divisions to bridge. But as he looked back on everything that had brought him here, from the moment of frustration in the hotel lobby to the courtroom that changed the course of his life, David felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had made his stand. He had fought for what he believed in. And in doing so, he had given a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. The journey was just beginning, and David was ready for whatever came next.